In this video, we will show you how to replace your front lower control arm on this Toyota Sienna. This is part of your front steering and suspension, located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. We're going to have to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, to remove the wheel, remove all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. Now that we've removed the wheel, the next thing we need to do is pay attention along the front of your front strut. We're going to dislodge the ABS wire and your brake flex hose from the lower aspect of the strut area. To do this, we'll be using a 12mm to remove the mounting bolt. As you remove all of your hardware, give it a close inspection. If it looks like anything's rotted and damaged, you want to go ahead and replace it. Can reach in this area, we can start dislodging this. Want to make sure we do not put a tug on this as we continue. Let's continue on in the center area here, removing our axle nut. To remove your axle nut, you'll be using a 12.30mm socket. With the axle nut off of there, we'll continue on with a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle. Once you've broken the axle free, continue on to installing a lug nut to hold your rotor in place. Let's make our way down to the bottom of the suspension. We're going to separate the ball joint from the lower control arm. To do that, you'll find that you have one 17mm headed bolt and 2 17mm mounting nuts. Continue on, you want to pull down on the control arm in comparison to the ball joint. While pulling down on that, you can pull the ball joint and knuckle away from this area. Continuing on, we're going to carefully start pulling the knuckle away from the vehicle. While doing so, we're going to pull the axle out from the backside of the wheel bearing. Careful for any pinch points for this. The next thing we'll focus on is our transmission mount. Now to remove the inboard mounting bolts for the control arm, we're going to have to remove our transmission mount right along the side here. Up along the top, you'll find that you have a 19mm headed mounting nut. Let's pause on the transmission mount and move to the forward engine mount. To gain access to all of the mounting hardware, we're going to start by removing this plastic cover from under the area. It's held in place with a push clip. You can use a trim tool or small prying device. We'll just pull that right out of there. At this point, you should be able to flex this down enough. Behind this area, there's a rubber plug. Get that right out of there. A quick inspection, it's a good idea to reuse these. At this point, we can start removing all of our 14mm pieces of hardware. The next piece of mounting hardware is directly in front of this. And the last piece of hardware is up inside of the port that we had removed that rubber plug from. Now moving from the front mount, we'll be back underneath this area. What we have to do is start applying some upward pressure underneath the transmission pan. When doing so, you want to make sure you have something flat and soft pressing against the pan, and you never want to press against the center of the transmission pan. With that said, we'll just apply a little bit of pressure here. While I'm doing this, we're attempting to lift the transmission up, and we'll be paying attention along the transmission mount. You can see the transmission starting to lift here. We'll be very careful for any pinch points throughout the entire process. Now, we don't want to cause any damage here. Once it feels as though the transmission's under pressure, we're going to pause. All we're looking for is a small gap in this area. At this point, use some locking pliers. Take hold of that stud, turn it counterclockwise, and remove it from the mount. I can see the stud coming up along the top. If you can get it out by hand, you can continue on by doing that. Otherwise, we'll just continue on with those locking pliers if necessary. A quick inspection of the mounting stud to make sure it's not rotted and damaged in any way. Let's move along the bottom of that transmission mount. We're looking for our lower mounting hardware. You can see one out in the open here. Towards the front, you're going to find a rubber plug. Once again, just go ahead and pop that free. That'll expose the next piece of mounting hardware. As you continue making your way back, we're going to skip this port and make our way up through here for the final piece of mounting hardware. We'll start removing these using our 17mm. Take hold of the transmission mount. We're going to have to lift it up, rock it away from the transmission, and pull it up and out of place. This can be a little bit of a tight fit. A quick inspection and we'll set this aside. With that mount out of the way, we have a clear view of the front mounting bolt, but if you were to move rearward just behind the axle, you can find the center mounting bolt. This one we can't remove until we dislodge the sway bar. We have to actually be able to pivot this up and down. To be able to pivot the sway bar, you have to follow the sway bar to the link and then follow the sway bar link all the way up to where it connects onto the front strut. We're going to remove the mounting hardware here, separate it, and then we're going to go over to the other side of the vehicle. Remove the wheel and then remove the upper sway bar link from the front strut. Removing your upper sway bar link, if you were to look in the center of the stud, you're going to find that you have an area for a Torx bit, unless yours is rotted like ours. If that's the case, we're going to make our way along the back side of the strut and hold the stud with some locking pliers. We'll make sure we get this as tight as possible, but you want to be careful not to cause any damage to the boot of your sway bar link. Use a 17mm to remove that mounting nut. Now we're over on the passenger side of the vehicle. As I mentioned, we're going to remove the wheel, and then we're going to remove the upper sway bar link from the front strut. With the passenger side dislodged, we can make our way back to the driver's side, and you'll find you can lift up and down on that stabilizer bar. Now, to gain access to our final mounting bolt, the rearward one, we're going to have to make our way under the vehicle and remove a plastic shield. To remove your plastic shield, you'll find that you have 4 10mm headed mounting bolts, 2 across the front, and then you'll also have 2 across the rear of the same plate here, 1 there and 1 over on the passenger side. Aside from that, in the center, you should have a plastic push clip. It looks as though ours is already missing, but for that you'd remove it last and use a trim tool or a small prying device. Remove your shield. Now we can start removing the control arm from the subframe. Let's start with the rearward bolt. This rearward bolt is a 19mm head and it goes straight up through. Along the top there, you're going to find a 19mm headed mounting nut. Let's move towards that middle bolt now. For this, we'll be using 22mm. Make sure you're holding onto the control arm. Once the control arm separated from the subframe, make your way to where that center bolt was located. You're going to find a small bracket. Go ahead and remove it. Continuing on, we have to take hold of the steering knuckle and pull the ball joint away from the lower control arm. Once we do have that separated, we'll be pulling this control arm down and away diagonally, away from the subframe. Be careful for our axle. Once you have that pulled out, the next area that we need to focus is along the back side here. Sometimes you'll need to use a pry bar to gently pry it out of there. Other times you can just give it a light tug. There it is, friend. With the control arm out, the next thing we'll do is clean and inspect all of the subframe where the brand new control arm will sit. You can use a wire brush for this. We want to make sure nothing's rotted and damaged in any way. If it looks like the subframe's rotted and weak, you want to go ahead and replace that subframe. It's a safety issue. This one looks fine. Now we can install our brand new lower control arm. When we put this in position, we'll be starting along the back side here. We want to make sure we slide it into the port of the subframe. As you start bringing it in, you'll find that you have to come at an angle, but generally if you just lean towards the rear a little bit, you can align that rearward mounting bolt hole. Now we'll pause here and continue with our rearward mounting bolt, sliding it straight up and through and starting on the mounting nut up along the top. We will not tighten this yet. Let's get that mounting nut on there. Once again, we are not tightening this. Let's continue on by pivoting this into the proper position. While doing so, we'll have to pull away on the knuckle. Be extremely careful for the axle boot at all times. We do not want to cause any damage. Now that we have the rearward bolt in, we'll continue on with our center bracket. It's important to make sure you have this in the proper orientation. We want to have this port facing towards the front, not this way. Slide that right on there. We'll continue on to our two mounting bolts, starting them in by hand. When we go to tighten these bolts, we're going to do it in a specific sequence, starting from the front, making our way towards the rear. We'll snug each of these first, and then we can torque them to manufacturer's specification. Let's start torquing the two front bolts, starting from the front here, making our way towards the center. The torque for these are 148 foot-pounds. Make our way back here. The rearward bolt is torqued to 103 foot-pounds. Now it's time to reinstall the transmission mount. We'll take this and slide it into position. We'll have to come down at an angle, bringing it down into the subframe. With the mount slid into the subframe, let's continue on with the upper stud. You'll find that I applied a thin amount of blue thread locker on the threads. We'll take this and slide it down and through the transmission, aligning it with the mount. At this point, you may have to pivot the mount around to get it aligned. We'll start this in by hand. We want to be sure we are not cross-threading this into the wrong position. Just attempting to tighten this as much as possible by hand here. It's a little quicker than with those pliers. At this point, it feels as though it's bottomed out. I'm going to make sure it's nice and tight using these locking pliers. There we are. Now we're going to slowly lower the transmission, making sure that we're not binding or getting caught on anything. Along the bottom, we'll continue on with our mounting hardware. One of the mounting nuts is out in the open. The other two are inside of the two ports that you can see along the bottom of the subframe. Once they're all started, go ahead and bottom them out. Now I'm going to torque these to 50 foot-pounds. Let's make sure we protect that port. Just reinstall that cover. Now we can get the upper mounting nut on here. We'll be using our 19mm to snug this up. Now I'll torque this to 65 foot-pounds. In this area, you have three 14mm headed mounting nuts, one out in the open right here. The next one will be located just in front of that. Just pull down on that shield as needed. And the last mounting bolt will be inside of the port of the subframe. This one's fairly hard to see, but it's just up inside that hole. With each of those started, now we'll snug them up. Now I'll torque each of these to 36 foot-pounds. Now that we have everything tight, we'll make sure that we protect our port. Just put on our plug, press that in. Continue on with your plastic push clip. Make sure that's secure. We'll move straight rearward for our rearward shield here. For this, we're going to slide it into its plastic clips across the front. Continuing on, you'd want to install your push clip in the center. After that, we'll install our forward bolts. If you were to look at your 4 bolts, you'll find that 2 of them are coarse thread like this. Those are the forward mounting bolts. Moving to the rear, we'll be using our fine pitched mounting bolts. These come in at an angle. Snug them up. Double check to make sure your shield is completely secured to the vehicle. Now it's time to attach the lower ball joint to the lower control arm. For this, you're going to flex that control arm down. If you need to, you could use a pry bar for this. Continue on to aligning everything. You're going to have to push the axle into that wheel bearing a little bit. Along the bottom, we'll be continuing on with our hardware. As for the mounting bolt itself, you may have to carefully start squeezing the ball joint and control arm together. We want to make sure we do not cross thread this into the wrong position. Once they're started, snug them up, torque them to 68 foot-pounds. We'll make our way back looking at the ABS wire, the flex hose, and our front strut. We're going to re-secure everything here. The first thing you want to have is the ABS wire. We're going to take that and put it in position, aligning the mounting bolt hole. Once you have that in place, we'll continue on with the flex hose. That slides right underneath this area, holding the ABS wire in place as well, and we'll continue on with our 12mm headed bolt. Start it in, snug it up. Make sure it's completely secured. You don't want it coming loose and hitting up against something, potentially damaging it. Let's move along to reattaching the sway bar link to the front strut. At this point, we're going to snug up the sway bar link nut. We're going to torque it to 55 foot-pounds and do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Let's install our axle nut. When installing your axle nut, you never want to use an impact tool on this. By over-tightening the axle nut, you can cause damage to your bearing. Now it's time to torque the axle nut. What you may find is that it's going to want to spin on you. If that's the case, you could have a second person inside of the passenger compartment holding the brake pedal, which will in turn stop this from turning, or you can get this closer to the ground with a pry bar diagonally holding it in place. As we bring the bar across here, we'll make sure that we are not causing any damage to our lug studs. We'll torque this to 217 foot-pounds. Once you do have it torqued, the next thing you need to do is pay attention to the slot that you can see on the tip of the axle here. We're going to use a hammer and punch and drive the nut into that area, locking it in position so there's no way this can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Let's get this off of here. One last quick inspection in this area, and we'll reinstall the wheel. After you have this wheel installed, you want to make sure you go over to the passenger side, confirm that you did install that sway bar link properly and torqued it, and reinstall that wheel as well. We'll get the wheel back on the ground, and we can torque each of these to 76 foot-pounds. Start on all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. Bottom them out. With the wheel safely on the ground, we'll be torquing these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friend, once you've finished torquing both of your front wheels, the next thing you need to do is go ahead and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.